press room was buzzing with anticipation. Karoline Leavitt, young, sharp, and unflinching in her convictions, had been sitting quietly at the table, waiting for her turn. But today something was different. The usual back and forth was about to take a sharp turn. A reporter, one of the usual faces from the liberal news network, leaned forward with a gleam in his eye. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he addressed her. "Ms. Leavitt, don't you think you're a little too inexperienced to be in such a high-stakes position? I mean, at 27 you're still figuring things out, right? Isn't this a seat better suited for someone who's actually seen the ropes of Washington?" The room went silent. A stunned murmur rippled through the journalists. The question hung in the air, bold and dismissive, meant to undermine her credibility with a simple jab at her age. But Karoline wasn't rattled. She didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She just smiled, poised and composed. The reporter thought he had her cornered. But little did he know, Karoline's response was about to change the entire narrative. Karoline Leavitt had been a force in the political scene since she stepped into the spotlight. At only 27 years old, she was already one of the most outspoken young conservatives in the country. She wasn't afraid to challenge the system, to push against the establishment, to speak her mind, even when it meant facing off against the biggest names in media and politics. Her rise had been swift, and it had earned her as many critics as admirers. The liberal media loved to target her, calling her a child in a grown-up's game, belittling her accomplishments, and dismissing her as another naive millennial. To them, her youth was her weakness. They believed they could chip away at her confidence, push her to crack under the pressure of their constant critiques. But what they didn't realize was that Karoline wasn't just some rookie. She had been molded by her values, her sharp intellect, and a relentless drive to make a real difference. Her age didn't define her. Her character did. Today's press briefing had taken a new turn. She wasn't just going to respond to the usual questions. Today, she was about to confront the deeper issue, the assumption that age and experience were the only qualifications that mattered. And when that reporter asked his loaded question, it wasn't just about her age. It was about his assumption that she couldn't handle the weight of responsibility. Karoline could feel the weight of the room's gaze as the reporter's words hung in the air. The silence stretched on for what seemed like an eternity, and yet, she remained calm. It was as if the pressure was nothing more than a passing breeze. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. She knew exactly how to handle this. The reporter leaned forward, expecting an awkward pause or a defensive answer. But when Karoline finally spoke, her words cut through the tension like a knife. "Is that what we're doing now?" Karoline asked, her voice steady and firm. She raised an eyebrow and the room held its breath. "I mean, we're questioning people based on their age? Really?" She shook her head, her gaze never leaving the reporter. "Is that how low we've sunk?" The reporter, clearly taken aback by her unflinching composure, tried to push the point further. "It's not about age, Ms. Leavitt. It's about experience. Experience matters in politics, and surely you can see why some might question your qualifications." Karoline smiled again. She wasn't intimidated by his repeated jabs. "Experience?" she repeated. "I have plenty of experience. I've been speaking truth to power, challenging the status quo, and fighting for the American people since I was in college. And if that's not enough experience for you, then perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with a system that's been run by the same tired politicians for decades." The room shifted. Several reporters exchanged glances, their expressions filled with curiosity. Some had expected her to stutter or back down, but instead, she was doubling down, calling out the very premise of the question. She continued, her voice rising slightly with passion. "The very same people who've been sitting in Washington for decades, collecting dust, cutting deals in backrooms. Now those are the ones you're telling us have the experience we should admire?" The reporter shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. "That's not." "No." Karoline cut him off, her voice rising with every word. "You can't tell me that decades of inaction, of empty promises, is somehow more valuable than fresh, bold ideas. And you certainly can't dismiss me because of my age when I'm the one actually trying to make change." The room was electric now. Some reporters nodded, others scribbled furiously in their notepads. The tension had shifted from Karoline being on the defensive to her being in control. And just when the reporter thought he could squeeze in another question, a new voice cut through the air. "Hold on a second," came a familiar tone. It was President Trump. The entire room turned toward him, and Karoline's expression softened for a moment. Trump had been silently watching from the side, but now he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the reporter. "What is this?" Trump asked, his voice cutting through the growing murmurs. "You're questioning a young woman who's done more in a year than most of these so-called experienced politicians have done in their entire careers? This is what you're worried about? Her age?" The reporter froze. His arrogance faltered for just a moment. Trump wasn't done. "Let me tell you something. People like Karoline, people with passion, with drive, with the courage to speak their mind, they're exactly what this country needs. We don't need more of the same old nonsense from Washington. And Karoline? She's not part of that system. She's a breath of fresh air." The room was silent for a beat. Karoline didn't need to say a word. Trump had already made her point for her. The reporter couldn't argue. The rest of the journalists could only watch, stunned into silence. Karoline took a breath, and with a calmness that was both disarming and powerful, she addressed the room once more. "Experience doesn't come from sitting in a seat for decades. It comes from doing the work. It comes from listening to the people, not the elite. From actually standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Her gaze locked with the reporter, unwavering. "And if you're asking me whether I'm qualified to serve? Look around you. The fact that I'm standing here, holding my ground against questions like this, is more experience than most could handle." She paused for effect. The room hung on her every word. "The real question we should be asking is, why are we still tolerating the same old system that only gets us more division, more gridlock, and less progress? Maybe it's time to stop judging people by their age and start judging them by their actions." Karoline's words resonated. They weren't just a defense of her own qualifications. They were a challenge to the entire political system that had long prioritized career politicians over real change. She had set the record straight, and in doing so, she had reshaped the conversation. The reporter stood speechless, his smug expression wiped clean. There was nothing left to say. Karoline had turned the entire narrative on its head, and the audience knew it. The days of dismissing younger voices were over. Karoline had shown that true experience wasn't measured by age or tenure. It was measured by the impact one had on the world. The room broke into a low murmur of approval. Some reporters even exchanged nods, acknowledging the truth in her words. For a moment, Karoline stood taller, more assured than ever before. And as she glanced over at President Trump, who gave her a silent nod of approval, she knew one thing for certain. The conversation had changed. Forever.